I mean, if I understand it,
Doing okay.
I think people will be mad. Maybe I don't though.
Yeah.
Hey, Steve, we were just talking about where we're headed. With,
All right, everybody. It is 10 on the dot. And we do have people live streaming from other places. I'm not sure if my whole family's on Wisconsin. We're on last time. But we probably should get started. So thanks to those of us, thanks to those of you who are in the room. Please feel free to get up, come and go. We are not upset by doors opening and closing. So that's not a problem. Enjoy bagels and coffee. So thanks for coming. So really excited to continue our leadership speaker series. We started in the fall. We had a great conversation just a couple weeks ago with Valerie Brader, and I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker in just a second. But first, I want to make sure that I pitch the last two speakers for this semester. So since February and March have the same days, March 11th, we will have Regina Strong, not Regina Bell. She's also awesome. Regina Strong, who is the environmental advocate for the state of Michigan. She runs the Office of Environmental Justice, and she's phenomenal. So I hope you'll join us in a month for that conversation, 10 o'clock, same time, same place. And then after that, we've got Hillary Doe, who is the Chief Growth Officer for the state of Michigan. So that'll be a nice one to end it up and tie all the themes together that we've had a great time talking about both this semester and last semester. So, and Jonathan and Hillary are both alumni. So that's my alumni connection for all y'all. So without further ado, I'm so excited to have Jonathan Smith here with me today. Jonathan and I have known each other for a while. I certainly haven't known him as long as some other people in Michigan. He's got a really great career history, both at the federal level and the state level, which you're all going to hear about here in a minute. He's doing some really cool work for Governor Whitmer and on behalf of the state. So I'm really excited to hear about that. And I know that there's a lot of interest in how do we think about the economic transition? And Jonathan's office is really charged with that work and with shepherding it for the state. So Jonathan, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I was hoping you could start off by telling us a little bit about your career, because it is a pretty storied past that you have.
Yeah, it's, I don't spend a lot of time like looking backwards. And so in anticipation of this, I was thinking about how do I describe, kind of how I've ended up doing what I've been doing. And it's, I did not start out at the beginning of my career kind of with a plan or a goal in mind. It's taken a few twists and turns. I got really lucky when I was in college. I decided to do an internship at the state capitol, and I got to go work in the office of a young state senator with a bright future named Gary Peters. And that internship—
You've heard of him.
Yeah, right. That internship turned into a part-time job, and I ended up being, part of that team for a year, but, sort of never left. But, at the end of that experience, or during that experience, I decided, I got to figure out how to get to DC. I want to see, how this kind of stuff works at the federal level. And so maneuvered my way into being able to finish my last semester at college while I was in DC, had an internship with Carl Levin. That turned into a temporary job, turned into a full-time job. And eventually I was working for the Senate Armed Services Committee, and, had this path of being a national security defense policy person for my whole career. The staff director, had taken me under his arm and said, you could work on this committee for 30 years. This could be your entire career. And I sort of had thought that was the direction I was headed. But this was at the beginning of the George W. Bush administration. And I had this strange experience of watching the run up to the Iraq war and being the sort of 24, 25-year-old who was, to me, it seemed obvious that this was insane and that, like, the national security infrastructure was being, manipulated and just, but I was surrounded by these people who'd been decades in this space, and they were all very confident that, no, the president would never lie to the people about intelligence, and, that we've known Dick Cheney for a long time, and these are responsible. And so I had this experience of just like, say, I can't do this. I can't be in this space. It's crazy. I got to get out of here. So I came to Ann Arbor and went to law school for 3 years. That was my way of sort of bailing out, because I just wasn't sure that I could wasn't sure what my path was going to be. And I spent a few years at a law firm, didn't really love it. And in 2007, got recruited to come back to Capitol Hill and work for John Dingell. And it really was this experience from like 2007 to 2010 or so, working for Mr. Dingell, and then going to work again for Gary Peters when he got elected to the House during this period, during the Great Recession, where I got to do a lot of really amazing work on public policy. I sort of realized I was good at it, and that I had a approach in a perspective that was, somewhat unique, and that I loved it and I cared about it. And so that was, I was really like 30 years old before I sort of figured out what I wanted to do with my life. And from then on, it has been that was nearly 20 years ago, and have been on this sort of singular journey around trying to use the opportunity to work in public policy to solve problems and to kind of bring entrepreneurial solutions to the public policy environment. And but it took some like twists and turns. It wasn't obvious when I was like in high school or college that like this was what I wanted to do.
Yeah, and I always like to ask people, what would you say to yourself in college right now? If you could speak to yourself, what advice would you have for yourself back then?
Um, the advice I didn't get, and I had to sort of go out and get for myself, was that there is no one's going to hand you a playbook. Like, there's no sort of guide to becoming an adult. Like, no one's gonna map things out for you. And but you have the ability to sort of chart a course for yourself. I had to drop out of college for a year and like live in Europe with like a suitcase and no plan to sort of like figure that out. It was it took me sort of a shock to the system to sort of get me out of my rut and make me understand that like I could just go and be independent and solve problems and figure out things for myself. It probably would have made my parents really happy if I had been able to figure that out without leaving college for a year. But that was the real sort of eye opener for me, was that you could just go and engage and push and shove and try to make things happen, even if there wasn't like an obvious path forward. So that would probably be the advice I could have used earlier in my college career.
Well, that sounds like a personal characteristic as well as a professional characteristic, right? Being willing to push and shove. So can you talk a little bit about why you think you were drawn to this type of work?
The thing that I really love about it, and that makes me passionate about it, is the ability to solve problems. If you are if you're really good at doing public policy work, the thing you get to do is read the paper or watch the news or like go online, and you see a problem that exists in the world, and you can pick up the phone and you can call smart people, and you can try to understand like what are the ways that public policy or government are either making this problem worse or could be deployed in service of fixing that problem. And a lot of as I've done a lot of work in like innovation entrepreneurship, learning from people who've done this in the private sector, launching, high growth tech companies, it's I think it's a really similar mindset of saying, okay, I can see a path here to do something that is fixing a problem, solving a gap, filling a need, and can be relentless in service of finding the resources and the solutions and building the coalitions and trying to create that solution that solves a problem. And then you get to solve that problem and you get to start all over and like solve the next one. And so what I really, really love about this work is on a day-to-day basis, or really, like on a year-to-year basis, I'm constantly like learning new things, taking the skill set I have and applying it to a different subject area or a different particular problem. And I sort of have this freedom to kind of keep myself busy, like create my own work, because as long as I'm like identifying these problems and can come up with a path forward to a solution, I have a lot of latitude to really, define what it is that I get to work on, and that sort of freedom and flexibility, and then solving problem solving, that's the fun part of the work, and it's what keeps it exciting, year after year.
So what fun problem are you working on right now that gets you really excited?
Yeah. So for the past, year and a half, have been very, very focused on the challenge of, economic transition in Michigan. Really started out, the governor's office asked me to help think through a strategy for auto communities. And then when the legislature passed and the governor signed into law the package of clean energy legislation, it created a specific office called the Community and Worker Economic Transition Office that is tasked with helping the state prepare for clean energy transitions in the energy and utility sector, but also the auto sector. And so we've put together a strategy and a set of policies and programs that, when put together, are designed to help our existing manufacturers, our manufacturing communities, and the people who, work and live in those communities, give them the ability to see the future that we're trying to create, and take steps today to benefit from the potential growth opportunity we're going to see in the future. And that's a really exciting and different approach than we've taken in the past. In 15 years ago, and Liesl, you were part of this work. During the Great Recession, when tens of thousands of people were losing their jobs, when hundreds of companies around the state were going out of business, we were trying to build a clean energy sector in Michigan, and it was hard. And one of the things that was hard about it was sort of managing these two problems at once. This steep economic decline on the one hand, and then this growth opportunity on the other. And like the good fortune we've had for the last few years, and hopefully this continues to be true, is the transition that's happening right now is happening a lot more slowly, which means that we can be more intentional and strategic in how we create these pathways into future economic opportunity for communities and businesses and workers that 15 years ago, didn't have that chance. It was things were happening too quickly. The economy was collapsing around our feet. And so, there wasn't this ability to say, hey, you're a manufacturing company who's making an auto widget. We can help you get the capital and the technical assistance and the workforce training necessary so that you can transition into this new sector, and take advantage of that growth opportunity. You don't have to close down your plant and have that be a brownfield that now needs to be remediated. You don't have to lay off your workforce, which then has to start collecting unemployment and go back and get trained to work in some whole new sector. Like we can try to make sure that folks are moving into these new growth opportunities in a way that's planned and less disruptive to the overall economy. So it's really exciting, and obviously, still at the very early stages of the work, but if we can do it here in Michigan, it's great, because I think this is a model for every other state that has, a manufacturing sector can use as a template for change in their own state.
So obviously, the work that you do at the office, as you've mentioned, is focused on the auto sector, focused on the energy sector in particular. So there's a lot of themes here of sustainability and the climate challenge that we see in front of us. Can you talk about how that presents itself, those sustainability issues, those climate issues present themselves kind of on a daily basis, so to speak, for the work that you're doing with the office?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, and one where I think we need to rethink how we think about the sustainability and climate focus of the work. When the office was created, the coalition that came together in support of that clean energy package included the environmental community, included organized labor, and it included a subset of industry, but largely just the kind of utility companies and some of the manufacturing firms and the startups that are very specifically in the energy space. The broader business community was not part of that coalition. And for a lot of folks, whether it's in industry or just regular people living their lives, you know, they care about the climate. They want their kids to have a healthy planet. But as we've seen, right, they also care about the price of eggs, and they care about, the cost of cars, which are, have gone up a lot, and are now, out of reach for a lot of consumers. Um, and so, obviously figuring out how we can scale and expand the deployment of clean energy technology in service of our climate goals and our sustainability goals is critical. But not everybody who could be part of this coalition is going to have that as their entry point. And so showing folks that focusing on clean energy and really proving to people, not just telling people, hey, clean energy is a growth opportunity. Clean energy is where there could be jobs in the future. Don't just tell people, but really try to show folks around the state that, um, that they have that this can be something that makes their lives better. It can lower costs on their home energy bill, but also it can create a job, or it can help them their employer become more economically viable in the future. Bringing more people into this coalition, whether their priority is climate or not, I think is like how you strengthen the coalition of people who support these kinds of policies, and ultimately how you make them sustainable. Because if we're not finding a way to bring more people into this coalition, my worry is what we'll see is what we've seen in the past, right? Which is this just becomes a political football where these coalitions of environmentalists and labor and energy sector folks will put in place strong laws and strong goals, but then those things become unpopular because they're perceived as not being in the economic interests of everyday people, and you see those policies reversed. And so how do we stop this ping pong back and forth and get some consistency so that we can actually meet these goals that we've set for 2035 or 2040 or 2050? Like if we're not continuing to make progress, it's gonna be really hard to reach those goals. And that means we need to figure out how to bring more people in this coalition. So sustainability is a huge part of it, and it's obviously really important. But figuring out how we can build around that to show that economic opportunity, prosperity are as important and are sort of an equally viable reason for someone to want to care about this stuff is a big part of like what I do.
There are like 14 threads I want to pull on there. So I'm sure others will have questions later too. I'm going to stick to, we spend a lot of time here talking about communication and talking about how do we think about talking to the person in the other chair. And so I think you rightfully point out that there are different reasons that people come to this coalition. And I can certainly see a large opportunity in the entrepreneurship space, in the economic development space, in the innovation space, and frankly, in the competition space. So I don't remember if I saw you, but I was at the Detroit Regional Chamber Policy Conference a couple weeks ago, and there was a lot of talk about electrification, and not in the way that I think a lot of the conversation is perhaps around here, but more broadly in the space of how does the U.S. auto market stay competitive with what goals are set in other parts of the world, and what level of manufacturing is happening on electrification in other parts of the world. And I'm sure that drives a lot of the conversations that you have. And so if we bring people in for those prosperity conversations, like it's okay if a sidebar is getting to our climate goals.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the dynamic that you're talking about is we're seeing that play out right now with this kind of change in administrations and this potential change in policy towards EVs and batteries. Historically, in the auto sector in particular, you've seen, industry, and it was a relatively unified block, and always kind of pushing against regulation and increased focus on climate or energy issues. And the approach that was taken by the Biden-Harris administration and through the Inflation Reduction Act was as much focused on global competition as it was on climate. So 15 years ago, we created a battery industry in Michigan that was, competitive globally. And we had companies that were launched here, some of whom are still here, like LG, but some of which are not. And the companies that did not make it through that period over the last 15 years, a lot of those companies their assets were purchased by China. And in the 15 years since we were a battery leader, what we've seen is, China's really taken the lead. And to the extent now where, every major American automaker, the batteries that are going into their cars are, technology that is licensed from, produced by a global company, a company that's headquarters and IP exist outside of the United States. And, that is in the long run very dangerous for the United States of America, both in terms of batteries are a critical national security component that we will need for all sorts of different reasons, whether it's the reliability of our electricity grid or national security, because these will be powering, the next generation of military equipment. I mean, batteries are going to be in everything. And so if we can't, have the next generation cutting edge battery technology produced here with American IP, that is a risk, the same risk that we have when we're dependent upon foreign oil. But the other, challenge is that if we want a growing and prosperous economy, innovation is at the heart of prosperity, because innovation is what creates profit, and profit, when it is healthy, gets distributed in ways that are really beneficial, right? And so during the 20th century, when the auto industry was the most innovative, profitable sector in the country, that was what, sustained and supported the growth of middle class in Michigan. So, and obviously having, collective bargaining and all sorts of other tools helped there enormously. But what we've seen, since the 1990s is manufacturing wages used to be above average, and now they're below. And we've seen the rise in where we see above average wages is in these knowledge economy jobs in the tech industry and financial services. And that shift happened because those industries were where innovation was really happening the most. And so they were having the biggest profits, right? So when you see the companies that have the biggest, stock market values and are reporting the biggest quarterly profits every cycle, those are the companies that are able to support high wages, and it's in their economic interest to do so because it's fiercely competitive. Innovation is the most fiercely competitive thing in the world. And so, this is where it all kind of comes together, right? As the world, the United States of America, we're a very big country, but we are a small percentage of the world's population. We are a shrinking percentage of the total economic output as China and India and all these other countries grow, right? We're still always going to be a very important economic player, but in the auto space, North America is the third largest auto market. We're smaller than Europe and we're smaller than China. And so, if we want American companies to be profitable and to be able to support the kind of wages that lead to broad prosperity, we need to have companies that are globally competitive. And that means, those companies need to be at the cutting edge of all these technologies that their global competition is leading right now.
And oh, by the way, if we do innovation correctly, we're also leading on the climate changes that we need to make from a
100%.
deployment of clean energy through the economic transition.
Well, it gives us the opportunity, right? Like I do not believe that China cares more about climate change than we do. In fact, like it's pretty obvious that they don't, right? And you see it in the continued, use of coal and lots of other ways. And so what we can do in the United States of America that's different, right, is both, pursue our climate goals and pursue our economic competitiveness goals at the same time, which I think is a much healthier way of, leading in the world. But we only get to do it if we're willing to lead on both. Like if all we're leading on is climate and we're not focused on the competitiveness issues, we're ultimately, not going to be successful in driving either of those, because it's really the economic growth and the innovation that bring the entire economy around, that brings voters around. I mean, it's all has to be happening, or else it endangers, the rest of it.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to balance when we think about making sure we're taking everything along for the ride and everybody along for the ride. So let's just go back to your career a little bit, because our master's students think a lot about working in the public sector, working in the private sector, working in the NGO world. Can you talk a little bit about what your experiences have been and what kind of advice you would give to students as they're thinking about positions in those different type of sectors?
Yeah. So, for me, I think the distinction is less about public sector versus private sector. I think the distinction that I think has been really relevant for me has been big versus small. So, small teams that are highly aligned around shared goals, that, those teams give you the ability to collaborate really quickly and easily and effectively. They give you the ability to be creative, to try things, to work together towards, these sort of shared goals really effectively. And so, for me, where so much of my focus professionally has been on, policy reform or enhancement or thinking about creative and new ways to do things, those small team environments are really fun. Working in a big organization, it's a lot harder to do change and reform. Big organizations get big by staying the course, by figuring out what works and not deviating from that. That's how you grow. That's like ultimately what makes a big organization successful, is that, consistent long-term strategy and focus. And so the trick for me has been, navigating between big organizations and small organizations has been understanding that if I'm going to be at a big organization, I need to figure out how to be part of a small team that has a clearly defined mission around change management or around launching new initiatives or strategic initiatives. And so, that has been what's kept me in state government, which, is, big and bureaucratic, but like the reality is private sector big companies are even more siloed and bureaucratic than government sometimes. And so, that distinction of like public versus private, I don't think for me has been the most critical. It's been about what's the kind of work I want to do. And if I'm going to be at a big organization, how do I carve out a role, that recognizes that what I'm going to do is, that I'm going to be empowered within a large organization to have the sort of change role that I know, like I thrive in and enjoy, which isn't, always the case.
And has that been true for you in the role that you're in right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I came into state government 4 years ago at a department, but with a relationship with the governor's office where it was understood that, Leo in particular was a place where new strategic initiatives were going to be launched from. And so over the last 4 years have had a series of exciting projects related to, small business lending or innovation and growth in the economy. Obviously, the transition office has been a main focus for a while. But, I've had sort of been understood that part of my role was sort of supporting some of these new initiatives and thinking about, how state government could work differently to sort of achieve some of the goals that the governor's laid out as part of her agenda. So that has been really exciting. I have lots of colleagues who don't do any of that stuff, right? They keep the trains running, and that is enormously important, like making sure that a large organization that, every large organization, it comes down to moving people and money. And there are people who are really, really good at knowing all of the different ways to move people and money around to make sure that the things that are supposed to be getting done are getting done. That is like a really important skill set, and people who are good at organizational management play like a really important role in doing that. What I do is different oftentimes, and it's not better or worse. It's just it's a slightly different approach, and I think ultimately strengthens like a large organization to have small teams that can do that sort of more kind of creative work. But you need both to have a healthy organization. And so but for me, just knowing that I've got the mandate and the authority to go and do things that are more in line with like my skill set and my passion has been how I stay sane in a very large organization.
I'm wondering what our faculty members think right now, because their positions are even different from moving people and moving money. But just to stick to the conversation that we're having, what are you most proud of from an accomplishment perspective when you look back over your career so far?
Yeah, that's a tough question because I don't spend a lot of time looking back, and I'm always sort of thinking about the next. Like I'm sort of never satisfied, so I'm always I'm always more excited about the thing I haven't done yet than I am about the thing I've already done. You know, and the other weird thing is sometimes the stuff that you work on that has the biggest impact, like because you have to build such a big coalition to get it done, it sometimes feels like your own role, you know, it's harder to appreciate that like your role in it was as impactful. But probably the biggest policy thing I've worked on and led, I helped create a draft of legislation and worked with the Obama White House and then Gary Peters, when he was in that House of Representatives, to pass. And it created a federal program to put funding at states to support small business lending, and in particular, lending for, you know, what are called second stage growth companies, which in Michigan's a lot of that's manufacturing firms. And so, you know, 15 years ago, this program still exists. It's, you know, been hundreds of millions of dollars in capital that's gone directly into small businesses as a result of this program. That capital all gets leveraged on a pretty enormous, I mean, so we're talking billions of dollars of new lending that has gone into small businesses because of this program that I helped create. So it's probably like the most impactful thing I've worked on. But it's, you know, the things that when I look back that I'm most proud of are probably smaller things where, you know, my role was, you know, may have had a smaller impact, but it was more personalized because I could see and feel the impact. It wasn't a national program; it was something very local. So, like when my last job on Capitol Hill was working for a member of Congress from the West Coast who was from a timber community. It's the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, and you know, he came to Congress really passionate about helping timber communities that had been left behind in a lot of ways, had been, you know, globalism, sometimes perceived was, you know, environmental policy that played a role. But, you know, you had these communities that were timber mills and you know, timber sector in these rural parts of the Pacific Northwest, where they, you know, went from being very prosperous, thriving communities to communities that are really challenging. So not that different than Michigan in terms of, you know, that trajectory of seeing communities that were very prosperous have some really tough times. And we didn't pass legislation. We didn't, you know, well, ultimately did, but the initial work was, how do we just bring people around the table from the environmental community and the timber industry to talk about shared goals and to try to get everybody to work together towards things that they had in common. And this was like a big deal because, you know, this is a community where, you know, environmentalists have been chaining themselves to trees, and like there was, you know, environmental terrorism was a thing that was happening in these places in the industry. Yeah, it was just this real fierce fight between industry and the environmental community, and a lot of bad blood and a lot of bitterness and people who wouldn't even sit down and talk to each other. And we put together this plan to create a timber collaborative, and we took folks from the timber industry and folks from the environmental community, and we went out into these forests and we walked around, and, you know, the timber guys would say, so here's a stand of trees, and, you know, we could harvest some of this and it would actually improve the forest health. And the environmental folks would say, oh, wow, okay, yeah, I guess if you do it that way, that could be good. And so we sort of spent a lot of time like building this coalition of people and getting people to like work together and realize they had a lot in common. And that turned into a formal memorandum of understanding that was signed by these groups that the Forest Service can now use to increase harvest in these ways that, you know, industry likes, but are also environmentally responsible. It's good for the economy. It's good for ecology of the region. You know, and it didn't have like the big national impact of some of the other things I've worked on, but you know, it wouldn't have happened if me and my boss hadn't pulled these people together and got them around the table and just done the work. And that kind of stuff is really interesting because you know, we think about policy as like, how do you pass a bill or how do you put $100 billion into some program? But there's also just these very small scale things that you can do in communities that have just a huge impact, not only in terms of like outcomes, but in really changing the culture and the tenor and the tone of what happens in that community. So that's the kind of stuff that ultimately, like, when I think back about like what's the most rewarding, oftentimes it's like these much smaller community scale things that feel the most rewarding in hindsight.
There's a lot of need to bring people together, and I can see a lot of parallels in that experience with what we need to do in Michigan by bringing folks together to talk about the economic transition that we're going through, you know, both on an energy side as well as on the automotive side. So I can really see the parallels. Let's talk about our friends at the federal level, because I think there's been a lot of discussion about that, obviously. Yeah, I will just, that's enough to say there. I was having a conversation with some faculty members yesterday, and we were talking about the issue of uncertainty, because my comment was that when you work in the legislature all the time, you get this message from industry that uncertainty is really difficult because businesses can't plan when there's uncertainty. And so my comment was, I think what we have learned in the last few weeks is that uncertainty is a really big deal for everybody, particularly in the public sector, because there's so much uncertainty in the public sector, and that is spilling over into so many different areas of our day-to-day life right now. But I was kind of curious your take on. Oh, so I'm sorry. So I should say I got some pushback from those faculty members who said, no, uncertainty is just a red herring that the business community uses to try to avoid any sort of regulation. And my comment was, in my experience, that's not true. The business community, you know, nobody's a monolith. No community is a monolith. However, you know, actually, you know, there are times when regulation can be embraced when it is done in a way that does clear things up and does send clear signals to the market. I am a big believer that public policy matters, and that we make the decisions we make, businesses make the decisions they make because of the regulatory structure that we live under. But I was just curious from your perspective, what you think about this concept of uncertainty right now, given, you know, the swirling winds that we're in the middle of.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So, I mean, uncertainty is a problem, but certainty can be a problem too. One of the challenges we've had has not been uncertainty. It's been these wild swings back and forth towards a certain path in one direction, and then we do a 180-degree turn and we have certainty in a different direction. And in some ways, uncertainty might actually be an improvement, because, you know, industry left to their own devices could chart a course and try to figure out how to navigate it. But the challenge really has been this pressure to go in one direction and then have to change gears and go in another. And the role of the business community here is complicated. I remember so one of the things I got to work on was the Dodd-Frank financial re-regulation legislation. So after the Great Recession, during the Obama administration, the Treasury Department proposed and Congress took up legislation to reform the financial services sector and address some of the structural flaws that had led to the bank failures and the crisis that we saw during the Great Recession. And spent a lot of time working on that. Gary was on the Financial Services Committee, then Representative Peters on the Financial Services Committee.
I'm amused that you call him Gary, but you don't call Mr. Dingle. You call Mr. Dingle Mr. Dingle.
Everybody, yeah.
I know, right? But it just cracks me up, right?
Yeah. So he was on the conference committee. We were very involved in the drafting and passage of that legislation. And at one point, they took a group of us up to Wharton, to the business school, for like a 2-day seminar with like business and banking regulation leaders. And it was like all the sort of C-suite executives, and not principally or primarily the lobbyists or the regulatory attorneys or the folks that we worked with in DC. And, there was one panel in particular where there was a group of senior executives talking about how, if you could just write these simple rules and give us this clear direction, and we would be able to follow it. And it's, everything is so complicated and the regulation is so detailed. And I went up to this guy afterwards and I said, look, you guys have a bunch of lobbyists. I take meetings with lobbyists all day long. I've never had a lobbyist come into my office and ask for a more simple set of rules to follow. Every single time they're coming in to talk about a carve out or exemption or a special provision that would help them. Like, things are complicated because the economy is complicated and the world is complicated, but also because, like, you guys spend a lot of money to make sure that the regulations that we have benefit you specifically. And that means when everybody spends a lot of money to have lobbyists to go in and like get their special thing, you end up with like very, very, very complicated policy. Yeah. And he was like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And I'm sure nothing actually changed, right? I'm sure they still have a bunch of lobbyists doing all the same stuff. But so, it is like, it is a complicated environment, and so there is always these swings back and forth, and you do have a lot of lobbyists on all sides, right? Advocates, like there's nothing wrong with being lobbyists. There's nothing wrong with advocating. It's the First Amendment. But there is a lot more because things are so, I think the lesson that industry and everyone has learned is in a world where things are always going to be moving back and forth, in a world where that's going to create more uncertainty, deploying your resources in service of a narrow fix just for you is the most effective strategy. And, when everybody does that, you end up with just a lot more complicated regulatory environment for everybody to have to navigate. So, I wish I had a great answer for, how we get through it. I mean, I think part of it is, in my mind, like thinking about the climate and sustainability space, it is like, how do we broaden that coalition? How do we make sure that, if there is a change in who is in charge, there's still a consistency and approach on policy. We used to be really good at this. Throughout the whole, most of the 20th century, we had these large authorization packages that would move through Congress, and they were designed to take coalitions that were oftentimes, so they built bipartisan coalitions in order to ensure that the legislation would always move in a sustainable way. So the transportation package had, road dollars for rural communities and transit dollars for urban communities. And that package of legislation would move together, and it would pass with 400 votes in the House and 90 votes in the Senate. And it was non-controversial. The agriculture bill would have crop subsidies for rural communities, food subsidies for urban and rural poorer communities. And that would be a bipartisan package that would move like on a massively, consensus basis all the time. And what we've seen over the last like 20 years is a real intentional effort to sort of break apart some of those coalitions, and now, more of a party line focus on every single thing. So that's, on the sustainability and climate side, why, I just continue to believe figuring out how to bring more folks who right now are, maybe hostile to a clean energy agenda or a climate agenda, bring them into the coalition, understanding, climate might not be their principal goal, but maybe it is, energy efficiency and cost savings so that they can get, more efficient and more competitive globally because they're lowering their cost of production. Maybe it is because we're creating, this new manufacturing base and this new opportunity to expand manufacturing in the United States with more export opportunities. Like, figuring out how we bring those folks to the table, I think is like how you start to put together some of those coalitions that can be lasting and that can get you a consistent policy approach, despite the sort of left and right turns of elections and a policy and regulatory environment that feels very like ping-pongy.
Yeah, well, convening and building coalitions has definitely been a theme today. So we're going to do the lightning round because we have some really excellent questions, I'm sure, in this audience. And so I want to give them a chance to ask you what I haven't. Okay, here's lightning round. Favorite place?
So growing up, we would go camping at what was then the Platte River State Park near Super Bear Dunes. So canoeing on the Platte River is probably like my favorite thing I do every year and have since I was a little kid.
First job?
My first job was working for my dad, who had a family landscaping company, like mowing lawns and doing yard work. My first job outside of the family business was bagging groceries at a grocery store.
Book or podcast or something you've read or listened to lately that you want to make sure others pay attention to?
I have been listening to like everything that Ezra Klein has been putting out, well, before the election, but really since the election. It's just, I think, nobody who seems to be able to articulate how I'm feeling about things better than him right now. And I just finished Demon Copperhead, which, kind of was a big book that my mom convinced me to read, but it was great. Just highly recommend.
Yeah, I just read that one too a few months ago. What never fails to make you laugh?
My kids, whether they're trying to or not, always give me something to laugh about.
Good. All right. We are going to definitely have some good questions in the audience. So who wants to go first? Oh, James is always got his hand up front row. Go ahead, James.
Thanks, taking notes and everything.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here. Great leadership talk. You mentioned that there are a number of competitiveness issues and that being competitive is an important component of achieving the climate goals in a way that brings everybody along. Well, can you name some of the big ones that are sort of front of mind right now? And what kinds of opportunities?
So a big competitiveness issue right now, like thinking about the EV space. So historically, I said, industry kind of acted with a unified voice when it came to some of these environmental and regulatory issues. And what we saw over the last, few years was, some of the Detroit-based automakers, and in particular GM and Ford, made really, really, really big bets in being globally competitive on EVs. And these are companies that currently, very competitive in the market for large trucks and SUVs in North America, but have largely exited a lot of foreign and overseas markets where they used to be active. They have really exited the segments within the North American market for small fuel efficient ICE vehicles, and have been losing market share to European and Asian companies who've come to the United States for 40 or 50 years. But if you look at EV sales, obviously Tesla is still number one by a pretty big margin, but American-based company. But GM closed out the year number 2 last year. I think Ford was either 3 or 4, right close with Kia Hyundai. What you didn't see was some of the other Asian companies that have been really dominant in light vehicle sales, and some of the European manufacturers that are often perceived as producing higher quality models, right? GM and Ford are kicking everybody's butt on batteries and EVs. And the real danger, I think, in terms of competitiveness is if we see a slowdown in EV adoption, that will mean less cost for industry in some ways. It'll mean more time to adapt and let consumers catch up. But it also means this competitive advantage that GM and Ford in particular have built here in North America is at risk. The marginal EV customer who is no longer incentivized to purchase an EV, they're not going to go purchase a big truck or an SUV. They're going to purchase a small fuel efficient vehicle. And those are not segments where the Detroit-based automakers are market leaders the way they are in batteries right now. So that is an area where I have a lot of concern that a change in policy is going to hurt the competitiveness of those companies. And you think about how that plays out here in Michigan, a lot of employees, not just producing, and assembling vehicles for the big 3, but you think about, Dearborn and the Renaissance Center and Auburn Hills, where there are a ton of really, high paying jobs in engineering and marketing and sales and legal and all the stuff that, get right. And so if those companies are unable to recoup their investment that they've made on EVs as quickly, that puts the economic competitiveness of those companies in our state really at risk. And so, that's a space where I think you can see this really close tie between, policy and economic competitiveness, and then what that means for prosperity.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you so much for being here. We've talked a lot about your points in our classes, and it's nice to see how those frameworks are being applied. My question for you is, what have you found to be the most helpful for communities / what would you think would be most helpful for communities in this transition to clean energy, especially employees who are deeply in the oil and gas and automotive industry, and that's where their expertise is? What do you think is most helpful?
Yeah, so the work that we're doing in the transition office is we're sort of thinking about programming that supports communities, programming that supports employers, and programming that supports workers. And obviously there's a lot of overlap. And so, if you're helping one of those stakeholder groups, you're probably helping the other 2. But on the community side, the biggest thing that we have heard from whether it's, kind of city managers, mayors, county economic development, any of the folks who are thinking about the prosperity of a community and their role in it, it is that question of uncertainty that like the big corporations have, I mean, times a million, right? Because if you're a small resource constrained, municipal leader, you have no idea what the future of, economic growth opportunities are. You're reading the paper, trying to understand it like everybody else. And so, we've done now 18 community roundtables all over the state. And in every one of those communities, there's either a group of people who have a plan for the future, or if they don't have a plan for the future, they have some sense of like what they think their community strength is, what their community's values is, sort of what they want to build for themselves in their future. And what they lack is, capacity and information and support. And so a lot of our community-facing programming is designed to say, we're not going to come in with a plan for you. What we're going to come in is with information and with data, and we're going to empower you and add to your capacity to build a local plan that leverages everything the state can learn about where the economy is going in the future, and where our strengths as a state are, and where some of our challenges are going to be, so that you can come up with your own plan, and then we are going to help you implement that plan to the greatest extent we can. And so that's really been the primary sort of focus of our community-facing work, is just trying to add that capacity and support. On the worker side, it is, the big insight we've tried to bring to this is, if what we do is wait for someone to get laid off and then try to help them get retrained to get a new job, like, that's really hard to do. It's just really hard to do. And so the best thing we can do for a worker is help their employer not go out of business in the first place. And so that's where that sort of notion of how do we provide support for employers so that they can get the retooling capital they need, the technical assistance, the business planning services, and workforce retraining dollars where needed to stay in operation, to diversify, to find new product lines, to enter into new sectors, working with the utilities as purchasers, working, with all these different sectors, try to help them, help these companies understand where they could pivot to grow and sustain their operations. That's like the best thing we can do from workers. Beyond that, like trying to improve the state's ability to do rapid response, try to think through, do we have the right set of, workforce supports in place for folks who might need, if they're gonna lose their job, if there's a loss in pay, a differential in pay between the old job and the new job, are there different types of support? So thinking through, where are the gaps in workforce programming for the future is something, we're thinking about. But those are big problems, right? Those are problems that are going to require legislative solutions or financial solutions. And so, the best thing I think right now for us is to just try to stabilize and make more small employers around the state, sort of stable and resilient in the face of economic change, and then hopefully be able to work with the legislature and other policymakers to put in place the right policies so that, if we do have more business failures, we have better solutions in place now than we had 15 years ago.
Really fascinating talk. A lot of different things I want to follow up on. The thing that's jumping out to me right now is, we're in this moment where we have divided government at the state level, we have unified Republican government at the federal level, and my research kind of shows that these are the times when we can build coalitions, right? Because there's less urgency around passing legislation urgently, so you can kind of think about, okay, how do we build the coalition that's going to get us to the next big policy when that window of opportunity appears? And from your experience in the Pacific Northwest with the logging communities and environmentalists, from your experience here in Michigan with the coalition building between environmentalists and labor, what lessons have you learned that we can apply in this moment for building coalitions?
Yeah, I think it's about identifying like the win-win, right? Like, I'll give you an example. Some of the work we're doing right now, my last answer, I talked about what we're trying to do is find diversification opportunities for manufacturers. So one of the things we did early on was sit down with our state's large utilities and say, what are you guys thinking about buying? And we got them to sit down with us and open up, their sort of capital budgets and supply chain needs for the future. And we're in the process of working with them to put together some programming so that what we'll be able to publicly announce in a big way is a huge commitment on the part of the utilities to spend billions and billions of dollars over the next decade, making a more resilient and more reliable energy grid that's going to, be better for Michigan consumers. And in the course of doing that, the state is going to support them in having more existing manufacturers here in Michigan move into their supply chain to get the retooling support they need, to get the business, planning they need to move into this supply chain. And, what I didn't do was go to the utilities and say, you should do this because, we're the state and we think it's important. And, you know, we've got a transition office and you guys should care about economic transition. I said, you know, like, what keeps you up at night? Like, what are some of the challenges that you have? And, you know, a couple of things, right? They've got, coming out of COVID, long lead times, a lot of critical equipment. And part of the reason they have those challenges is because so many of the sources of the stuff they buy are either, you know, foreign or from pretty far away within the US. And so it is a big win for them to get more locally produced equipment in their supply chain. It gives them a big competitive advantage against other big utilities in other parts of the state or other parts of the world. If there's a 3-year lead time on transformers right now, we could figure out how to make transformers here in Michigan. They'll be great for DTE and consumers. But then the other thing is, you know, if we have a economic transition that results in more manufacturing companies in Michigan going out of business, those are large industrial ratepayers who will no longer be buying electricity from those utilities, right? So building a coalition that included them around this project, even though I was asking them to do something like, hey, make a commitment to buying stuff locally, they weren't primarily doing it because the state was demanding it or requiring it. They're doing it because they see that it's in their own interest to do it. This is win-win. And so I think that's, you know, figuring out how to bring people around the table and really ask the question to understand what are the things that we can do that like benefit you and benefit us, and, you know, where's the sort of shaded area in the Venn diagram. And you know, I spent a lot of time since the election thinking about like, what's the national version of that, right? Because if you think about the industrial policy that the Biden-Harris administration and the Democrats in Congress were pursuing through policies like the Inflation Reduction Act, and you think about some of the things that we've seen, you know, folks like JD Vance or, you know, techno optimists like Elon Musk say about American competitiveness and a focus on manufacturing, and even you know, the vitality of the American communities in places like Michigan and Ohio, where there are lots of folks who are out of work and not in these sort of good paying manufacturing jobs the way they used to be. Like, there's a lot of shared agenda there that you could imagine coming together. You know, the challenge is like the broader that conversation gets, the more nationalized it gets, you know, the more challenging it can be to find the shared common goals, and the more like political issues that are, you know, can interrupt the ability to like get to that sort of commonality. But you know, it's sometimes easier to do at the local level, and then the goal is just build it at the local level and see if you can replicate it and scale it and expand it, and if, you know, maybe eventually you get to a national level coalition. But in my experience, it's like it is sometimes a lot easier to start that at a local or state level rather than trying to figure it out nationally.
Do we have one more? Sure, Steve.
I think it's about leadership, that the desire to have convening, get people around the table, prepare somebody to catalyze it, convene. In the Northwest, for example, we basically had congressional blessing and encouragement for this to take place. Same thing happened in 1993 in terms of the Clinton Florence plan. The appropriations packages had strong leadership at the congressional level. So it does seem like leadership is moving more towards polarization and different kind of. So how do we get back to that? So where are the nodes of potential meeting leadership? And how do we get back to that?
Yeah, so when I moved back here 4 years ago, I often found myself very confused by what was happening in Lansing. And I was confused about why I was confused, because you would, you know, there's a legislature, there's an executive, there's lobbyists, there's like all the same bits and pieces exist in Lansing as exist in Washington, D.C., but it works completely different. And they oftentimes get to outcomes in Lansing that I was surprised by. And so I didn't feel like that like my 20 years of professional history in DC gave me the ability to like to predict accurately how the same types of institutions would work through issues and get to outcomes. And what I realized was, you know, Washington, D.C. is a place that has got a ton of really high capacity, high functioning organizations and institutions, but the environment has just become completely dysfunctional. And so no matter how smart you are, no matter how much money you've got, no matter how like, strong a coalition you built, the forces of dysfunction are more powerful than like the forces of like than the capacity and the resource behind these institutions. Lansing is kind of the opposite. I mean, it is an environment where it is highly functional. You can get stuff done. I mean, the legislature passes hundreds of bills every session. They pass a budget every year. Like there is a mechanism to get things done all the time. But the institutions and organizations that exist in that environment lack capacity, and there's not a ton of institutional experience and knowledge and resource that comes to bear on these policy questions. And part of that's because of we've had a bunch of recessions in a row in Michigan. We've never really recovered from them. And so we've been cutting back budgets. And, we just have a undercapitalized and under-resourced legislative branch and executive branch. We've got term limits. I mean, just all sorts of different reasons. So, this isn't exactly an answer to your question. I don't know how to fix the DC stuff, right? There is a lot of powerful forces that like seem very tough to influence. But what I like about being in Michigan is like, you can get stuff done. And if you can add and enhance the capacity of the legislature or the executive or any of the organizations that are doing advocacy work within the state, like you can get to a great outcome. And I've seen it done, and I've done it over and over again over the last 4 years. And so I think the answer is, my solution is put my energy into the state and local level, because that's where you can build those coalitions. That's where you can still pass, you can get meaningful policy passed and enacted into law. And you can really see the difference it makes when it's done. I think the federal picture is just trickier and probably takes somebody a lot smarter than me to figure out.
Great. Well, like I told you, they'd be great questions, didn't I? All right, we're just a little over, so I think we should call it. Thank you so much for participating. Appreciate everybody being here. Here's your commercial. Regina is Tuesday, March 11th, same time, same place. There will be bagels. And so for anybody in the room, you win taking some bagels with you if you want to. So thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Probably was forced into this. Is that